really sorry about the rather strange start for some of us who seem to be thwarted in coming to today's talk with the church being locked up. But fortunately, there were several angels around, and one of them was able to help the situation and unlock. It's a real privilege that Hugh's giving a talk today on the recent history of our church. Initially, it was suggested that he might cover the past 50 years, but actually he's extended it in line with his own experience of this church to 75 years. And he, as you possibly already know, Hugh is an accomplished speaker. He has an incisive mind, and he also has a wealth of experience, not just of this church, but of the wider Anglican communion, and a deep knowledge of the history of the whole of Christianity. I'm ploughing through a book at the moment, which he's lent me, and it's a vast tome, I can tell you. And on top of all of that, he has a rather wicked sense of humour. So it'll be interesting to see which of those facets appears in the talk. But thank you very much indeed, Hugh. We're looking forward to hearing all about it.
Thank you, Sue. There's a well-known ecclesiastical story of the man who found himself in just the position that I've been in while Sue was attempting to describe me. And as the proceedings went on, he found himself praying two prayers earnestly for forgiveness. And one was for the speaker, because she was guilty of so many gross exaggerations, and the other was for himself, because he was enjoying it so much. But anyway, I've subtitled this talk, Progress at Last. It's set off with a question mark, and actually I want to keep that question mark, because I want you to think, as we go on, as to whether there really has been progress, and if so, how much and how important, and so on. Partly I'm going to talk about things in date order, and partly by subject, so I apologize if we go back and forwards a little. You're going to hear my own likes and dislikes. If you call them prejudices, okay. If I don't mention somebody or something which you think important, then sorry, these are just the ones that I think are. And finally, I fear I probably will assume some modest knowledge of the Church of England and its workings. But if I do completely lose you, then just wave a hand and we'll see where we've got to. Now, imagine a great river, perhaps in Africa. And we had a film mentioned yesterday, Passport to Pimlico. Anybody seen The African Queen and remember it? Yes? Quite a few. So anyway, so think of that river, and think of a river moving steadily on, thinking of it almost stagnating at times, and then suddenly we get a waterfall moment. And looking back 300 years, as we celebrate at the moment, plainly there was a waterfall moment then, with Hugh Todd and the creation of this enormous Georgian preaching box with its enormous central pulpit, so that the preacher could preach to the whole church, galleries and all. But then, over the following 250 years, not really a great deal. There was W.H. Milner, who's, we have his portrait there in the window, and much involved in the life of the town, new housing, new water supply, new sewerage, and so on. And then, towards the end of the Victorian era, the alteration of this end of the church to allow for morning and evening prayer sung being the main services with a surplice choir and so on. But by the end of World War II, coming to the period I'm trying to cover, all was flowing on rather placidly, and as I say, not much had happened. and a visitor from 1722 could well have recognized much of what was happening in the church. But there were the first signs of a coming waterfall. Just after the Second World War, Norman Robinson was appointed vicar. He was a bachelor and a scientist. But more particularly, he was strongly influenced by the parish communion movement. The slogan, I think, was, on the Lord's Day, for the Lord's people, the Lord's service. There was, of course, much opposition. And I think it appears from a book that his curate wrote that it was 4 or 5 years before he actually managed to drum up sufficient support to make the parish communion at 9 o'clock the main service. Even then, the choir were having nothing of it. And I won't say they went on strike, but they refused to sing at the 9 o'clock and insisted on remaining to sing at 11. So there we have a new service. And when I first worshipped here, which was in March 1957, it was not easy to find a seat anywhere downstairs at the 9 o'clock service. And of course, the service was according to the Book of Common Prayer of 1662, and by modern standards, very formal indeed. When a few years after that I was asked to read the epistle at that service, I had to be robed in surplice and cassock and remained within the sanctuary throughout the service, even for the reading. And that seems grotesque by modern standards. One other thing from Norman Robinson's day, but in the 1950s, Newton Rainey was added to St Andrews as remaining a separate parish, but a very successful union. And then at the end of the 1950s, Norman Robinson left. Ian McCallagh, assistant curate, remained here in charge for quite a time. I remember one story that he told me of how he happened to be in the church one Sunday when a wedding party suddenly arrived in full regalia and everything, and he inquired gently what they'd come for. Oh, we thought the vicar was here every Saturday to marry anybody who turned up. So he said something about banns of marriage and what have you and so on. Norman Robinson was followed by Richard Bradford, a man of some distinction. He was on the Church Assembly in London, and later its successor, the General Synod. He became Archdeacon of Carlisle and was my predecessor, bar one, as chairman of the Diocesan Board of Finance. I remember particularly from those days a major stewardship campaign with a great parish supper, visiting of every member of the congregation, pledges signed, and so on. And interestingly, secrecy was offered, but nobody wished their offering to remain secret, apart from, I think, one, on the basis that if you are giving what you believe to be right, having prayed over it, then there's no real reason why you should want to keep it secret. But anyway, that's quite the opposite of what happens nowadays, so I won't press that. Richard Bradford also trained 5 of us to take part in an ecumenical workshop run by lay people at Newton Rainey, and that involved 5 each from this church, the Roman Catholic Church, and Wordsworth Street. And again, those were interesting as being a first start towards the churches of Penrith coming rather closer together. Also in his time, 90% of the stones in the headstones in the churchyard were removed. The whole thing from sort of the east end of the church up to the banks was covered with tombstones. You could hardly walk amongst them. And apart from one or two where relatives were still alive, one or two of special note, like the lady who died at, as it was said, so you can still read, at the extraordinary age of 107 years, all the rest were removed. The southeastern quarter of what appears to be the churchyard, but isn't really, that was, had light industrial use. There was a bakery there, at the time a commercial garage, and so on. But later in the 1960s, Penrith Urban District Council bought it, and the Rotary Club laid out the garden. The only other thing I remember from Richard Bradford's day was that he had a habit of, after announcing some event, to say, and afterwards there will be sociability, which he said in a very special way. But anyway. But in 1966, he was transferred to Carlisle Cathedral. And the church wardens were invited to meet the bishop of Carlisle to discuss who he might appoint as the next vicar. And they asked me to go with them simply on the basis that I was more used to speaking than they were, or speaking in public. The only thing we had in mind was that there was a certain clergyman in the south of the diocese at Barrow who was said to be about to be moved and who really did not fit what we thought would be appropriate for this parish. So we were careful to put things together so that Canon Harold Stewart wouldn't be appointed. So I poured this out to Bishop Thomas Bloomer, and he replied, he was Irish, but I shan't try to replicate that. Oh, my dear friends, how glad I am to have heard what you had to say. As you know, Penrith St Andrews is very close to my heart, and I have been praying and thinking hard about who I should appoint. And I'm glad to say that I have managed to anticipate everything that you have told me, and so I have decided to appoint Canon Harold Stewart, and I shall be instituting him on the 27th of next month. Now, what the church warden said outside about that performance really is not fit to be repeated. But Harold Stewart was very much of the old school. He was trained before World War II. His curates had to read their sermons to him before they preached, and that I thought laughable because their sermons were much better than his. But anyway, and he liked his own way. The question came up of a carpet up here in the chancel, and the church council discussed it and agreed that such and such a colour would be best. And Harold Stewart said, well, what about gold? So no, we said that really wouldn't do and it would get very dirty. But the next thing that happened was we were told that a very generous benefactor had agreed to give a gold carpet. And it did indeed get grubby very quickly. Also, again, in Harold Stewart's days, he had two very able curates, both still alive, one David Crook, still living in Lowther Street, and the other Terence Sampson. And I don't want to give a total impression of gloom for Harold Stewart, because he did encourage me to become, to train to be a reader here, accompanied by the typical Stewart statement, because you're in Penrith but not of it. So anyway, so the parish continued as before and very little changed until we now come to my main waterfall. In the couple of years either side of 1970, everything almost everything did change. And looking back, I see now how important these 2, 3, 4 years were in the life of this church. Now, in no particular order, the two town parishes were united. During the 1960s, Christchurch had 3 vicars in succession, none of whom stayed for more than 3 years. So the bishop came to the conclusion that the only way forward was to unite the parishes once again, as they had been one parish originally, and have one parish of the whole town. Christchurch Vicarage, towards the top of Lowther Street on the right, was divided into 2 flats, one for each of the 2 curates, and the St Andrew's Curate's House in Brunswick Square was sold. Though the Christchurch Vicarage didn't work out for very long, and so the parish was soon forced to buy another curate's house, this time in Barco Terrace along Folly Lane. Later, the diocese fortunately undertook the housing of curates itself, rather than leaving it to parishes. Next, St Andrew's, the church, the building, required major work. A new architect, Norman Phillips, found that the main south wall was leaning outwards and carrying the gallery with it. And at one point, the gallery was resting on a mere 1/4 inch of one of the upright pillars. So another 1/4 inch, and the results would have been catastrophic. Also, the organ was in a bad shape and needed work. The wiring throughout the church needed replacement, and all this work meant a need for redecoration. Total cost was near £20,000, say £250,000 in today's terms, which we raised by a series of events: a sponsored walk to Great Salford and back, a pageant recounting the history of the town and the church, sponsorship of the gold leaf paint on the pillars, and so on. The organ, I agree, we didn't get right. Colin Marston has told me that more than once. Our only defense would be that we had bad advice. And finally, the decoration scheme, that which we have now. Norman Phillips didn't feel sufficiently qualified to recommend a scheme, so he brought in Stephen Dykes-Bauer, who was then the surveyor of Westminster Abbey. The previous colours were pink pillars below, leading to jet black pillars above, and finally a sombre brown ceiling across the whole building. Stephen Dykes-Bauer advised that the lower pillars should be near black to emphasize that they were load-bearing, carrying the gallery, while the upper part of the church should, as it were, float. And I still remember the sheer excitement when the ceiling was unveiled 50 years ago. The sun happened to be shining, and it all really looked at its best. We were looking for a local firm, but we were advised no. Campbell Smith & Co. of Liverpool were the people, leading ecclesiastical decorators, and the reason given was that their work would last. And 50 years on, yes, how it has. Now, another happening in my short waterfall period, Harold Stewart left after a bare 5 years here. And once again, the wardens and I went off to see the bishop, now Bishop Cyril Bully, and Rose Castle was once again in use, so he was back in residence there. And after the previous debacle with Bishop Bloomer, we decided to try to tie the bishop down. And so we asked simply for one thing: a man with ideas, and he would probably be in his 40s to have the time and energy to see them carried out. And the bishop was interested and asked us questions and so on. And the next evening, I got a phone call. I've changed my mind as to the man I was going to send you. So I thought, well, one up to you compared with your predecessor. I want you to go and see Alan Batty. And just for a moment I hesitated, because Alan was not a man whom you got to know very quickly, plainly able, but beyond that I didn't really know anything about him. And the bishop obviously thought I was not really taking any account of what he said, so he simply said, "You ask for a man with ideas. There is no man, no vicar in this diocese with more ideas than Alan Batty. Go and see him." So, in due course, Alan came. He'd been the first warden of Rydal Hall, setting up the diocesan retreat house from scratch. When he was appointed, he was the diocesan director of education and a residentiary canon of Carlisle Cathedral. And he, like Richard Bradford, was also on the Church Assembly and later on the General Synod. In many ways, a quiet and thoughtful man. As I say, you didn't get to know him quickly. And he had a disconcerting habit that if you asked him a question, he quite often paused in thought before answering, where most of us just produce an answer off the top of our head. But looking back, I think I'm prepared to argue that his coming was the single most important event to have happened in the life of this parish in the last 75 years. And so we come to another change in the 2-year period, and that relates to the form of service, the liturgy. When Harold Stewart arrived, the only lawful permitted service was that in the Book of Common Prayer of 1662. Parliament had turned down all alternatives. But in the mid-1960s, Parliament said to the Church, you can have a 15-year experimental period. In fact, in 1974, full power was transferred as to the form of services from Parliament to the Church. But anyway, the first 2 experimental services to appear were called Series 1, which was a rather dull, minor modification of the prayer book, which had been turned down by Parliament at the end of the 1920s, and then Series 2, which was a complete and exciting reshaping of the liturgy in the style of the Roman Catholic Mass, though still in 17th century English. Many of us hoped that, in fact, that was the service, would be the service that we would adopt. But Canon Stewart characteristically preferred Series 1. It was really what he was used to throughout his ministry. But the General Synod spent much of its first year, 1971, agreeing a yet more exciting service, Series 3. And I remember hour after hour in London of sitting through debates about the minutiae of liturgical language. And this Series 3 was in the Series 2 shape, but in modern English with several new prayers. And when Alan Batty came, he suggested that we move to that. And so with one bound, worship in St. Andrew leapt from the 17th century to the 20th at last. And that, of course, is still largely the service which we use today. And staying with liturgy, in 1980, the alternative service book, the ASB, appeared with a whole host of new services. And much of that book was written in Plumpton Vicarage by Canon Charles Whitaker, the vicar of Plumpton, who was also a most distinguished liturgical scholar with indeed an international reputation. And single-handedly, he prepared the baptism and confirmation service. He prepared the whole enormous calendar and lectionary, deciding on some 2,000 readings for use through a 2-year cycle. It was known in the trade, apparently, as Whitaker's Almanac. And he also wrote many of the prayers. And few people locally, I think, knew of all this. And only once did I hear him display his scholarship. the Deanery Synod was discussing a common baptism policy for the whole deanery, the sort of thing we did in those days. And Canon Bucks, Bill Bucks, the ebullient rector of Greystoke, got up after a time and said, we really needn't waste time on all this. All we need to do is such and such and such and such, exactly as the church did in the 8th century. And that brought Canon Whitaker to his feet. I have studied every known baptismal liturgy in use anywhere in the world from the 8th century. That is a fact. What Canon Bucks says is to be found there is not so to be found. That too is a fact, and sat down. It was the most devastating speech for its brevity that I ever heard. He retired in 1981, and Plumpton was then added to Penrith along with Newton, and so Alan Batty became the last vicar of Penrith and the first team rector. And we were told that the normal staff, as one looks back, would be 1 team rector, 2 team vicars, and 1 assistant curate. But I haven't yet finished with the 1970 waterfall period, because another small change in this short period was the closure in 1969 of All Hallows Bowscar, a small daughter church. And it has a fairly discreditable origin. The boundary between Plumpton and Penrith parishes is at Stony Beck. And so everything north of there is in Plumpton, everything south in this parish. And the owner of Bowscar House, which was just in Plumpton parish, fell out with the vicar of Plumpton in a big way. So in order to show him, he built a house on his land south of the boundary, just inside Penrith parish. And alas, the vicar of Penrith at the time agreed that he would see to the necessary services. So I think it was discreditable. In later years, it was down to occasional Sunday evensongs, and it now looks quite a handsome house from the outside. And a few years later, the other small daughter church closed, St. Saviour's Castletown. This was founded by one of the Methodist churches in Victorian days. They apparently didn't make a great go of it, and so, again, probably unwisely, St. Andrews took it over, and again, it didn't take off. And in later years, when I knew it, it was down to a midweek service plus a Sunday school. But by 1976, it was in a poor structural state, and the site was sold for a terrace of 3 small houses. But to return to Alan Batty, another of his major innovations was the use of this building for concerts. There was, of course, opposition. Secular music in a sacred building? Really, Vicar, what are you thinking of? But he persevered, and of course he's been proved totally right, and he created yet another tie linking church and community, indeed church and district. And by the end of his Alan's time, Ted Roberts of Arthur Street was running brass band concerts, so you can't get much more secular than that. The only trouble was the choir didn't like it because it meant the choir stalls were frequently moved to make space up here, and so they steadily fell to pieces. And then another change. When Alan came, St. Andrew's Vicarage, for the previous well over 100 years, had been halfway down Bridge Lane. It was a large Victorian gentleman's residence, well clear of the town. And 50 years ago, there were few buildings on Bridge Lane, apart beyond Tynefield House, walkers, some funeral directors, apart from a farm on the left and the vicarage and 1 or 2 others on the right. But Alan was not happy with the signals given by this, the large residence clear of the town, and so he pressed the diocese to buy another house, and in the end he and his family finished up in Fell Lane, just up from Sandgate on the right-hand side, below Brentfield Way. It wasn't actually a very good house, but it was smaller and it was in the town. And the old vicarage, of course, as we know, became Woodlands and the nucleus of the Methodist Homes for the Aged. Just taking the story of the vicarage forward, John T. Barnard, Alan's successor, lived in the house in Fell Lane. The diocese then sold it. The next vicar, Noel Carter, for a time lived in a rented house in Plumpton, in the village, which he described as awful because of the travelling. Then a house was bought at the bottom of Brooklands Drive, though by church commissioner standards it wasn't quite adequate. And the next vicar, Dick Woodger, was also there, though towards the end of his time the new build was created in Lamley Gardens. But to return to Alan Batty, he also started the matter of lay people taking Holy Communion to the housebound. Though his first attempt at this I wasn't totally happy with, because it meant after the 9 o'clock service I drove up to Roundthorne Lodge for communion with a charming lady in her 90s, down to oh dear, what's the little square called, just down Victoria Road on the left? Thank you very much. And there was a group of 4, then on to a lady on her own somewhere on Wetheriggs, and I knew that if I was more than 5 minutes early or 5 minutes late, she wouldn't let me in. And finally to what was then Rose Lodge, the old people's home at the bottom of Pategill, where the first difficulty always was getting the television switched off in the living room. And then I returned home for sustenance, liquid. So, Alan Batty was also one of the General Synod panel of chairmen, rather like the Speaker of the House of Commons. And we began to notice that it was always he who was put in the chair for major debates, because he not only understood the rules, but would be fair to all sides. He was elected chairman of the House of Clergy of the Diocesan Synod by an overwhelming majority against 3 other candidates. And so this parish, for a time uniquely, provided the elected leaders of both the clergy and the laity in the diocese. He would have been an ideal archdeacon, but for another episcopal performance, which I might call proudyism, which I still don't think I can describe in public. But he left Penrith in 1986, went to a parish near Cambridge, and died a few years later, still barely in his mid-60s, though having accomplished more than most of us. To mention one other person from those days, Reginald Goodburn. He was the church treasurer for over 25 years. The books were kept in his beautiful copperplate handwriting, and when he died, he left half his estate to be invested for the benefit of the upkeep of this building. It was then £50,000. It's now over 400,000. By some way, I believe, the largest bequest that this parish can have ever received. 1986, we managed to lose all 5 clergy. The first to go was the curate, David Wilmot. The second was Alan himself, followed in the summer by Walter Turner, team vicar living in the old vicarage at Plumpton, and finally Derek and Leslie Ridley. John T. Barnard, young and energetic, came at the end of the year to a ministry that was to be sadly cut short by a major stroke. He started lay people interceding at Holy Communion, previously limited to clergy and readers only. And he was followed by Noel Carter, who had been one of Alan Batty's assistant curates. Noel encouraged the church council to come to a decision about the parish rooms. They were by then in a very tired state and not greatly used. They were, after all, originally built for the various Sunday schools, up to the better part of 1,000 children on a Sunday. And these schools, of course, had largely ceased to exist, certainly in their original form. So Noel put it fairly bluntly, update or close. And the Church Council took a deep collective breath and decided to put all its reserves into updating, though many donations were needed as well. And so we owe the kitchen and the coffee shop and the general smartening up to Noel's initiative. He was himself no mean cook. I remember in particular a Chinese meal that he cooked for the parish, having gone over to Newcastle to buy the ingredients earlier that day. He also founded the Beacon magazine. This replaced the broadsheet, which was a single double-sided A4, supposedly distributed to every house in the town, but as the town grew steadily, that became impossible. And so, hence, we founded the Beacon magazine, of which Susan was the first editor. And then there was the televised service. ITV, National Channel 3, used to televise a service, church service, every Sunday morning. And one Sunday it was Border TV's turn to provide this, and they chose to come here. And this was indeed a great occasion in its way. Though I was to lead the intercessions towards the end of the service. And about 10 minutes before, the producer came and whispered to me, "We're running short. Will you fill the intercessions out?" And 5 minutes later, he came and said, "We're going to overrun. Cut the intercessions down." So I did neither, and hence the service did overrun and was faded out. But if anybody still wants to watch it and see what people looked like 30 years ago, we still have the DVD at home. And Noel Carter moved on to Parish of St. Brilard's in Jersey, and some of us went to his licensing there. My main recollection, I fear, is of the bun fight afterwards. Not merely were we served caviar, but we had to choose between 3 sorts of wine. They do things differently there. He was followed by Dick Woodshaw, a former railwayman, and we're now getting dangerously close to the present day, so I'm going to wind up. But just a few matters from his time. The first is the Millennium Window down there in the South Aisle, the most generous gift from Lindsay and Mary Kidd. And then coming to the Holy Communion liturgy, in 2000, the ASB was replaced by Common Worship with a wide range of options. So I want to say a little about the thinking behind the seasonal booklets, which we still sometimes use. We wanted the options to be used, but at the same time, we wanted to retain familiar material in each booklet. And those who lead worship will also know the danger when offered a choice of always going for their own favorites. So again, the booklets were intended to ensure that nearly all the options were indeed used, whoever was leading the worship. One of the things which I particularly remember was that Carol Farrar, one of the television team vicars, and indeed the first woman priest on the staff here, she and I were deputed to prepare independent suggestions as to which of the 8 Eucharistic prayers should fitted best each of the 6 seasonal booklets. And we came back with identical suggestions. Possibly the Holy Spirit at work, I don't know. And have the booklets now served their purpose? Quite possibly. Also, in Dick Woodger's time, we set off on modest improvements to the building, both inside and out. Dick himself especially led on the outside work, others of us on the inside. And looking first at the outside, if you come up the passage between the NatWest and Barclays banks, or if you're of my age, between the district and Martin's banks, the church was almost invisible. There were two enormous evergreens which spread across the path just inside the gate, and they were beyond being pruned. The gate itself, with its decorative ironwork, was in a very poor state. The path up to the church was also in a poor state, and so the trees were cut down, the ironwork was replaced, new paths laid both up to the west door and round both sides of the tower. And then access to the church was much discouraged by the fact that the heavy wooden doors had normally to be kept closed to stop drafts coming in. So glass doors were constructed just inside so that the wooden doors could be left open. And again, the sense of welcoming was enormously improved. Inside the church itself, the seating used to go in serried ranks right to the back of the nave. The only break was where the massive Victorian font stood on its pyramid of tessellated pavement. And several needs were identified. An open meeting area inside the church, at the very least for post-worship coffee, so it used to be coffee in the parish rooms, but most of the congregation was lost between one and the other. So a need for a modest servery, yes, we could have gone further, but the wish was always not to go much faster than the congregation were ready for. Also an easier route for processions. The old start of the service was for the procession to go from the vestry, down that aisle, disappear outside, come in through another door and up the middle. But again, by taking away the back pews and moving the font, space was made for that. And the font itself, the original medieval font, probably from about the 1490s, sitting on the gallery, twice lost, was brought back into use for the third time. The Victorian font was placed where it still is under the tower, and what I call the Georgian Birdbath font remains on the gallery. And the splendid details of all this work are a fine monument, in my opinion, to the vision and work of the architect Paul Grout. Well, I'm going to finish there. As I said, my title included a question mark after the words "progress at last." Please do answer this question yourselves as you think fit. You'll have guessed by now that my own answer is a resounding yes. By 1970, my river was almost stagnant. There was then a burst of activity, and from then on the river has flowed steadily, briskly, not too fast, that would be non-Anglican, but steadily on. And I do regard it as my privilege to have served here during Alan Batty's time, and then to have seen how in each successive decade from then on, the ministry and the mission of this church have been so well taken forward by others. There have been hiccups along the way, of course there have, and the river has meandered a little. But in general, what is going on today seems to me to be entirely almost entirely successfully built on the foundations that were laid 50 years ago. So, there we are.
Thank you very much indeed, Hugh. Are there any questions that people would like to ask at this stage? Yes? John?
Sorry, the main what? As I understand it, and I do stand to be corrected here, the original chancel was raised in Victorian days, 1880 give or take, but more work was done with the coming of the parish communion in 1951-2. But again, both those were before my time. Sorry, what, Tom? Yeah. The pews, I gather. Sorry, this is about the data for pews.
No.
Oh.
Were they available to buy when they were?
Oh. Ah. Pass. I should know that. I'm sorry. I think people did buy bits. Yes. Yes. I mean, some were worked into the servery, and one can see how they're done there. But I think others were sold. The pews in the gallery are said to be not original but Victorian. I would put these as later. So the answer, I've got an easy answer to this, John. It was before my time of 75 years ago. They're certainly not original, no. Oh no, no, far from it. Yes, yes. I mean, I can go back to medieval days and the old church, when, of course, though generally speaking, there weren't seats. There were just seats round the edge, and the weakest went to the wall.
Any further ones? Well, I think people might like to reminisce together over refreshments, which we're going to have at the conclusion of this. So do stay for refreshments if you're able to and would like to. I just have a couple of comments, actually, which, if you don't mind, I'll express now. I did like, Hugh, the idea of losing a font. I thought that was really quite a clever thing to be able to do. And the other remark, which I found quite funny as well, is how many talks have you ever been to where the speaker stumbled over TV, assuming that it meant Team Vicar rather than television? I rather like that, actually. It only could be Hugh, I think, who would just for a moment...
That shows the danger of relying on short notes.
Exactly so, yes, yes, yes. Very many thanks, Hugh, heartfelt thanks. I think we've all enjoyed joining you on that journey through the last 75 years of this splendid building, but more than the building, the people who make the congregation and who lead the congregation. And I think we've heard some really interesting stories as the history's been unfolded to us. It's been a rather busy time for Hugh recently. He and Susan managed a holiday in Venice, but they've also managed the family celebration of Hugh's 90th birthday. And just for good measure, he'll be replacing David Sargent preaching here on Sunday. So if you'd like to hear Hugh again, that's the time to come. David sadly isn't here today because he's got COVID and succumbed to that. No, this has been a real tour de force, and we thank you very much, Hugh. Thanks all of you. Thank you. And Hugh, I have something for you before you go. From us all. Here we are.
Ooh,
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well
Great.
deserved.
I shall come again.